mean? And so with that in mind, what is your mission takes on a whole new meaning if mission is service and service is sacrifice.
All right, this one's a winner. We're geared up, ready to go.
We are ready.
Great. Okay. Today we're going over devotional about service, and really the core question here is, what is your mission? Right? Last week we went through and individually we went around the table and we talked about what our why was for coming on this trip to Costa Rica, this mission trip. And I must say I was really encouraged by the different answers, and I really enjoyed listening to everyone's why, their reason for coming on the trip. It was a moment where I felt happiness and joy and community. But as I went through the week and I thought a little bit deeper about it, I start to question my own why and think of and especially when I was reading a passage in John 13, which we'll get to in a second, but the scene is of Jesus and his why for coming to this earth. And so with that in mind, I started to question my own why, and I hope that you also question your why a little bit. And I came to this realization, and I came to contend a couple of things, and one of those things is that mission, the primary aspect of mission is service. And I see some heads nodding. But the second layer of this, and what I'm going to contend, is that service is sacrifice. And so what does that mean? And so with that in mind, what is your mission takes on a whole new attitude, a whole new meaning. What is your mission if mission is service and service is sacrifice? In preparation for this devotional, I read a bunch of stories about, just to prepare, about different acts of service. Monty talked on Sunday, Pastor talked on Sunday about the different love languages, if you'll remember, if you were paying attention. Some of us, more than others, and that's just fine. But to recap, right, there's 5 love languages, and one of them is acts of service. It's doing something for your spouse or for the ones that you love. And some of us, I'm sure, are that love language. Certainly, it's doing things because you love people, doing the dishes or going out of your way. And so I spent some time in the Word, but I also spent some time on Reddit, and I was reading through some stories, right? On Facebook, on Reddit, I Googled it, acts of service. And I came across some interesting stories. One was a man named Jim, the construction man, and he was thinking about retiring, and he runs in his process of trying to decide, should I retire, should I not? I could use the money, but I feel like I might be at the end of my career here in the construction business. And he runs into a younger man and has a conversation with him, a man that he used to work with, and has been down on his luck. Come to find out, he's struggling to make ends meet, to provide for his wife and 3 children. And then after this conversation, he goes on Monday into his boss and hands in his letter of resignation to retire. And he turns around and says, who should replace me? That young man who used to work for us. Turns out that young man does end up getting hired, and so it turns his luck around and it turns his life around. There was another story that I came across that touched me, that it was about a man who had locked his keys and his cell phone in the car. A common instance, I'm sure. And he was obviously frustrated and angry and kicking tires and saying some choice words, I'm sure, when a younger man on a bike crosses his path and stops, and he asks him, "What's going on?" And the man explains, "Well, I've locked my keys in the car and my cell phone, and that's really a bummer, because it wouldn't matter if I could call my wife, even if I wanted to, because this is the only vehicle between the two of us. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how I'm going to get the keys." The young man says, "I'll go get them." He says, "But it's a 7-mile trip from here to there." He says, "I could use the exercise." He gets on, he hands the man who locked his keys in the car his cell phone and says, "Call your wife, let her know I'm coming." And he makes the trip up there. It takes him an hour and a half, 2 hours to do the whole thing on bike, but he returns with the car keys. The day is saved, right? And he rides off without so much as payment for thanks, really, much thanks of any kind. That was really neat to hear about. There was another story that also stuck out to me, and there's many stories like this, but of a doctor who had to give the patient the hardest truth that any doctor has to give. You know the words, right? It's cancer. You don't have long. That's rough. Not just on the patient, but on the physicians as well, to say those words to somebody else. That's okay. So she was walking down the parking lot, right? And she was thinking about this and was kind of bummed out when she looks over at a nearby car that looked broken down and saw there's Jimmy, the guy I just talked to, under that car. Jimmy, what are you doing down there? She says, and he says he was finishing up the work, helping a stranger out in the parking lot. And he gets up, he dusts his pants off, and he says, "My cancer didn't tell me not to help others." Now, you know these stories are not unique. These stories are in no way, I guess, special, although they are special. They are neat to talk about, and they're uplifting to hear about. And I certainly was uplifted when I did the research and I read through a multitude of stories just like this. I mean, there's hundreds. But I would argue that if you interact with people in a day, either online or in person in the community, when you're out and about, that there are opportunities like this that exist everywhere, that these are not unique. So why don't we have stories like this? Why wasn't our day this way? What makes these stories different than our stories? I'd like to tell you one more story about the ultimate servant, the ultimate sacrificer, the person who we look up to for service, and that's Jesus Christ. And I mentioned earlier John 13, and I'll read from it here. This is a scene from John 13. Some of you know the words. "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God, was going back to God, rose from supper, and he laid aside his outer garments, taking a towel, tied around his waist." Verse 5, "Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him." And then jumping down to verse 12. "When he had washed the feet and placed his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them," the disciples, "Do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for I am so. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done. For truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than one who sent him." So this scene out of John shows us the servant leadership of Jesus. Shows a scene, and you'll remember Peter, a part I skipped over, right? Peter objects even to the Lord doing this because there's something about this scene that Jesus is not just serving, but he's sacrificing. How can the Lord and teacher do this thing to me, this thing that's degrading, this thing that's dirty? Right? There's something about these stories, these four stories that I've shared here, that I think really get to the heart of this thing that we're talking about, this service thing, and that is sacrifice. There's an element of, it's not just me doing something, it's at an expense. There's a cost. In the first example of Jim the construction man, he sacrifices money. He had the opportunity, the opportunity cost of continuing to work, but he decided to trade his position for someone else. He sacrificed his money. In the second, the cell phone and the keys that are locked in the car, the young man on the bike sacrificed his energy, the work of his labor, the sweat of his brow. In the third example, the example of the man, the cancer patient, he sacrificed what's most precious to some of us, that is time. What would you do if you were given that diagnosis? How would you spend your last few months? Would it be the way that this person spent it? Would you ride 7 miles into the distance? Would you go and trade your station in life for someone else, for someone else's benefit? And I think that's really what this boils down to is, what's your mission? Is your why in alignment with this concept of sacrifice? Is your why in alignment with Jesus's idea of mission, his mission on earth, which was ultimately to sacrifice everything, to give it all? I think that's the real thing that struck me this week as I've been thinking about my why. Is it in alignment with this concept of service? And if service is sacrifice, then how do I become in closer alignment? What do I need to give up? What does my mission look like? I don't know. I would charge you with this, and that's to think hard about your why. We talked about them. We went around the room last week, and I'd encourage you to take some time to think about it and really take a hard look at, is this truly mission as I've defined it? Maybe you define it differently, but I would challenge you to define it this way, that mission and sacrifice and service are all interchangeable, that these are all the same idea. And maybe we can come to a finer point, a goal of service, of sacrifice, of mission. And maybe it looks different than what you thought it was going to look like. Maybe it looks a little less fun. But I promise you, on the other end of it, you'll have a story to tell.